morning, everyone. Is that better? All right. Welcome this morning to our special session. It's the grand discussion with questions and answers. We have split this into two parts this morning. First of all, we have some summary reporting from the three groups that we've chosen from the six. Now, those three groups weren't chosen for any particular reason other than they lend themselves more to reporting back from the members of that group. So we will get started. These reports are 5 minutes each, and first of all we have Patricia Calvi from Italy, and she'll be speaking about activating engaged membership. Thanks, Patricia.
Morning, friends. Morning. First of all, I wish to thank the members who joined my group looking for inspiration, because they made the discussion always lively, interesting, fruitful. I started asking them why, among all the possibilities, they chose this group. Then we examined what made membership desired and meaningful for each one of us. What persuaded, encouraged, stimulated us to join the TS. So we passed to consider if that impulse, that dream is still alive, and what Theosophy provided us with. Freedom of thoughts, tools for self-transformation, awareness that all is one, and the chance to participate in the divine plan. Then we examined some motivating quotations by HBB, the Masters, but not only, quotations useful to activate engaged membership. Quotation that was inspiring for the work of our fellow members and to galvanize ourselves too. We also took into consideration the mission statement because, as in the words of our respected President Tim Boyd, it clarifies the task or role of the TS in the world. The mission statement encourages us to serve humanity by cultivating self-transformation, and we consider self-transformation essential, crucial in order to inspire members and to attract sympathizers. Exactly as Cassandra Witten affirmed yesterday in her speech, it has much more to do with what we are, not than with what we do or have to offer, such as teachings, books, and so on. These only can really make the difference, can make us agents of change, as in Witten words, because it is what we irradiate that is first perceived by people, first and beyond any other factor. Our enthusiasm and gratitude for the ageless wisdom, that imperishable flame we have received as the most precious gift, and that made the difference in all our lives, will be contagious and will definitely influence our neighbor. We closed with the illuminating words by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who said, "If you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito." Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. There were some inspiring ideas there. Next, I would like to call up Mr. Wim Lees from the Netherlands, who will be speaking on new ways of making Theosophy known. Thank you, Wim.
we chose, of all the possibilities of the new ways to make Theosophy known, like Facebook and so on, we chose how to put together an introductory study course on Theosophy, with a specific instruction to the participants to make it contemporary in modern language, avoiding excessive metaphysical concepts, and directed to those who have never heard of the TS or Theosophy. The study course should present not only an exposition of Theosophy and its principles, but also of suggested ways through which it can be made practical and relevant for our daily lives. We thought that in the space of 1 hour we could address the topic in 4 questions. The first being, why is it important to make Theosophy known? This brings to mind verse 287 of Voice of the Silence. If you would have that stream of knowledge remain sweet running waters, you should not leave it to become a stagnant pond. So when you receive the light, pass it on. Think of how you yourself found Theosophy and what it meant to you. Second, is it possible to present Theosophy in a non-technical language? So, we agreed to avoid too much Sanskrit terms, which to the listeners are incomprehensible, but to put the terms in ordinary language. So, for instance, emotional body instead of astral body, mental body instead of manas, and so on. And when you use a specifically theosophical term, be sure to always explain it sufficiently beforehand. What key theosophical ideas should be included in an introductory study course? Well, all people have these life questions as they are presented on the website of the English section, for instance. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Who am I? Is there a goal in life? So these questions give us a beginning of how to decide which ideas should be included in our course. Because Theosophy tells us about the origin and goals of life and the universe, of the universe, man and evolution, about visible and invisible worlds. Because as we know, many seekers have had experiences, mystical or occult, and they're looking for answers on these experiences. Then, of course, the unity of life, the brotherhood of man. Which includes respect for all religions. And in the course we will talk about the religions and see what common ground they have, rather than what differences they have. Man as a composite being. Start with spirit, soul and body, a well-known threefold composite. And then extend that with the Theosophical sevenfold idea. And that can also lead to explaining the mystery of death and after, which all people wonder about. Isn't it amazing that the most important questions most people don't have answers to, so we don't understand life. And Theosophy wants to reach out to people with tools, mental tools, to understand life. And death and after will also lead to an exposition of karma and reincarnation. And that will always lead to the discussion of free will. Do we have a free will, and if so, to what extent? We use a term ancient wisdom that appeals to people and is a neutral term. And then we can also point out the mystery schools of the past and the path and initiation. And then as a fourth and last question, we put before the participants, how can such a study course help to inspire people to lead an altruistic life? Well, the unity of life leads to the acceptance of the idea of brotherhood and the notion that so long as one of my brothers or sisters suffer, I can't be happy myself. This feeling is a source of altruism. Such a course is not for persuading people to become members, for that must be entirely their own choice. Also, information alone is not enough. As Cassandra Wheaton told us a day after the workshops, it's only 10%. What is important is who you are and how you say it. To someone who really leads a theosophical life will be more appealing to the listener than someone who is merely ventilating theosophical knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Wim. So be Theosophy and make Theosophy practical. Lastly, of the group reports, utilising Theosophical centres, we have Mr. Minor Lyle and Els Reneke. I'm not sure if both of you are speaking or just one. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Minor.
Am I tall enough? Morning, everyone. I'm not tall enough. What do you know? So you've all heard reference to the Theosophical Centers project from time to time throughout this Congress. And the idea for this particular discussion group was to explore ways that the various Theosophical retreat centers might be better utilized. As it turned out, this was the smallest of the 6 discussion groups. There were 12 of us at the first session, and then none at the second. Some of you might know of the stories of the early days of the Theosophical Society after HPB and Henry Steele Olcott had left for India. There were times when William Quan Judge found himself lecturing to an empty hall. Well, rather than do that, Els and I decided to make the best of the situation and sat in on another group session instead of lecturing to ourselves. And as the overall coordinator of this project, and somewhat in the spirit of Cassandra Wheaton's presentation yesterday, I choose to frame this low turnout as an expression of how all of you are feeling that the project is in good hands. So thank you very much for that. And in fact, in addition to this group discussion, there have been a number of one-to-one fruitful conversations throughout the time here. The discussion at our one group session was also worthwhile. Most significantly, it brought out the need to improve awareness of the centers and how to access information about them. In fact, it was apparent that this is not just a challenge for the Theosophical centers, but also a general need for the TS as a whole. One of the participants in the group was describing how she had recently visited had been traveling and wanted to find out what was happening with the local Theosophical group, and looked up their website only to find that the information was 6 months out of date. Well, of course, this goes to the challenge all of us face in having enough workers or volunteers to maintain the information portals that we have already developed. And this is a real and significant challenge that all of us face. How do we develop the resources to maintain timely information? This was really probably the primary outcome of the discussion we did have. I'd like to conclude by adding that it was a real pleasure to work with Els Reinecker in coordinating this group. I really enjoyed getting to know Els better and look forward to future collaborations together. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mina, and thank you for a reminder to maintain our websites. I think all of us around the world need to make sure everything is up to date. So, next part of our grand discussion session is a very special panel. So I would like to call the panelists up, and you'll just need to give us a moment to get organised, so we won't be a minute. Thank you. No, I don't think it. Thank you. Yeah. There's our second one. Well, here we go. So it is an honour to introduce our panel to you this morning. We have Tim Boyd, International President, Linda Oliveira, General Secretary of Australia and former International Vice President, Vic Houchin Jr., former General Secretary of the Philippines Section, member of the General Council and trustee of the Golden Link College, and Pradeep Gohil, General Secretary of the Indian Section. So I welcome you all to the panel. Thank you. So let's jump straight in. Question 1. On the tension between different types of knowing, what is the distinction between the endeavour to know oneself, to accumulate self-knowledge and knowing doctrine, theosophical or otherwise, in ways that cut one off from continued growth and development? So we'll start with Vic Houchin on this one. Thank you.
My understanding of the question is about the role of knowledge, including self-knowledge and theosophical and other knowledge, in connection with our growth. I assume spiritual growth. I think knowing ourselves is something which is essential and obviously necessary, but I would tend to think that our knowledge should be integrative, wholesome. In other words, knowing something and not being able to integrate it with the rest of our lives, I think would lead to problems. For example, we can speak of brotherhood, and yet we have real problems in our relationship with our family members. wife, husband, or children. So there is a fragmentation between the knowledge and the life. So this kind of knowledge should be integrative, something that would include our physical body, emotions, mental, and spiritual life. The second facet, I think, in terms of spiritual growth is that knowledge is not enough. We need to add the element of self-awareness or awareness, because awareness, I believe, is the most important factor in spiritual development. When there is a lack of awareness, then our knowledge is mainly intellectual or mental, and again would lack the integration that would include awareness. So for example, meditation is not about knowing, but it's about awareness, and meditation is a very crucial factor in spiritual growth. So just to summarize, knowledge is important so long as it is integrative, and second, it must be coupled with awareness, inner awareness.
Thank you, Vic. Would someone like to add to that? Tim?
Obviously, I would concur with what Vic had to say. Famous quotation from Albert Einstein speaks about the idea that there is no problem which can be solved on the level at which it was created. And so when we talk about knowledge, very often we are somewhat specific in terms of thinking of it as something of an intellectual character. Even in our theosophical approaches, very often we limit ourselves in that way. And then when we try to apply that level of knowledge to addressing some of the issues we have in our own fragmented personalities or in the world, it's necessarily unsuccessful because, again, at the level at which these issues and problems are created, there has to be some deepening or rising beyond in order to apply some new energies to that. So the aspect of self-awareness, self-knowledge, is probably the element that is required. So the types of knowledge that are spoken about in the question are, they can be interpreted differently, but the knowledge that is probably the one that is the most potent and brings the other knowledges into their proper use is this knowledge of self that is often attained by meditation and self-awareness.
Thank you. Linda?
The second part of this question talks about knowing doctrines, theosophical or otherwise, that in ways that cut one off from continued growth and development. There is a phenomenon which I think of as the gap, and that is a gap between, for example, a knowledge of theosophical teachings and the actual assimilation, integration and practice of those teachings. One may ask, why is it that this gap exists? Perhaps there are a few reasons, and awareness has already been mentioned as a very important factor, or in this case, perhaps lack thereof. One question is, why do we study theosophical doctrines? If it is done essentially to almost appropriate information, to gather something to oneself and to build the self even further, then that's really counterproductive. It goes against the altruistic nature of these teachings. So that's one thing. And the more self-absorbed one becomes, the more difficult it is to really know oneself, because that very self-absorption is something which cuts one off from one's higher nature, if you like. And secondly, there's another factor too. And that is, when the heart opens, then all things are possible. So true self-knowledge comes about not only when the mind is sufficiently developed, but when the heart opens as well. And then, to use that well-known technical theosophical term, buddhimanas really comes into play. The Buddhic nature starts to flower, and that is when real self-knowledge can start to come about in earnest.
Thank you. Now let's move to the next question. Why in the history of TS the third object is underestimated and considered by some Theosophists insignificant? So I'll hand this over to you, Tim.
So we won't do like Richard and John the other day and make a test out of this, but the third object is to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent within the human being. So to say that it's underestimated, I don't necessarily, I wouldn't agree with that, because I think in many respects, and particularly if you look at the history of the Theosophical Society, perhaps it has been overestimated, if anything. As a matter of fact, the foundation of the Theosophical Society occurred on the basis of really some phenomenal sorts of programming. The first meeting of the Theosophical Society related to a speech that was going to be given about Egyptian practices, which were able to call into the world certain spirits. And so that was the basis for the founding, to explore further into these unexplored sorts of areas. Colonel Olcott was also quite renowned for his abilities in terms of mesmeric healing. And so it's something that has really been at the foundation of the theosophical work throughout. I think perhaps what the questioner may be referring to is presently, I think it's something that is perhaps more downplayed, the idea of psychic phenomena as powers. I do believe that when we talk about the powers latent within, very often we confuse them with psychic sorts of powers or siddhis of different sorts. But perhaps, the real powers that the most potent ones are the things such as the power of compassion, the ways in which that is something that is radiant and can affect others. And these are things that also are under study right now in terms of studying the energies and the potencies of these very sorts of things. So, again, I don't feel as if it's underplayed at all, but I'd welcome other thoughts.
Could I say something
Yes,
brief?
Linda, go.
I think that the powers latent in the human being are quite commonly misunderstood. And while psychic powers may be studied in different parts of the TS world as part of a broader inquiry into theosophy, they are not simply the powers latent in the human being. There are far deeper powers, and our president has just talked about compassion. There are things like understanding, spiritual intuition, spiritual discernment, wisdom, even will, awareness, words that are used quite commonly, but perhaps when understood much more deeply and realized, actually express themselves as some of those powers latent in the human being.
Vic?
When I was a young theosophist in my 20s, I certainly overestimated or overvalued this very much. I tried to remember my past life. I tried to look at water and try to dry it up. I tried I tried even to learn psychic surgery and so on and so forth. And then later, and this is what I'm grateful to the Theosophical Society about, later I realized that there were really far more important things in living than having these faculties. If I can learn how to levitate, I cannot come to Singapore by levitation. I have to take Singapore Airlines or something. Yeah. If I know my past life, it doesn't solve my present life problems. I have to face it now. Whether I know my past life or not is actually secondary. And that's when I began to realize that there are things like inner peace, as Linda mentioned, compassion, love, relationship, intuition, character building, which I found to be far more significant than any of these things. I spent years on these other things, and I realized that they're important for us to understand the inner laws of nature, but not really that important for now in terms of living the integrated or wholesome life. In the third object, there was a suggestion by one of the council members, Marcus Vicende, that perhaps the word potential is a better word than powers, that we should study the inner potentials of a human being rather than latent powers. But that's words. More important is the understanding of the purpose of that third object.
Thank you. All right, now a question I will ask of Linda. What is the esoteric school of Theosophy? I'll give that to you. Thank you.
Thank you. The esoteric section, as it was then called, was started by H.P. Blavatsky in 1888. Our president mentioned something of that in a talk the other day. And at that time, a primary reason for its formation is the fact that she said the TS had proved a dead failure in terms of brotherhood. And she brought together a group of people around her to help to try to really become, I suppose, a living example of a group based on brotherhood. And it was based on Raja Yoga principles. Fast forward 130 years or so, and the esoteric school of Theosophy, as it is now called, is still in existence. In many countries, it is still based around Raja Yoga, although not exclusively on that. It's separately constituted from the Theosophical Society, but there's a relationship with it, because in order to be a member of the school, you need to be a member of the TS for 2 years, be an active participant in TS work, and be willing to abide by a few conditions, such as vegetarianism, not taking alcohol, not smoking, I guess an altruistic outlook on life, a belief in the existence of the masters of the wisdom. If you are in a relationship, it needs to be monogamous, loving, committed, that sort of thing. So it's very much alive today. If anybody is interested in knowing more or possibly applying to become a member of the school, they're welcome to contact me and I will point them in the right direction. Perhaps I could add, there seems to be a misconception by some that members of the esoteric school are in some way more special than members of the Theosophical Society. That is absolutely not the case. It's simply a choice by some members of the TS to deepen their spiritual lives in a certain way. Thank you.
Thank you for that very clear response. Now, our next question, I think Pradeep might be asleep on the end there, so this I will hand to him. Can brotherhood apply at all times in all situations? I'll just amend that slightly. Can brother-sisterhood apply at all times in all situations? Thank you.
Yeah, I think Linda has partly already answered this question. You know, when she said that in 1888, Madame Blavatsky found that Theosophy was not practicing, or Theosophists were not practicing brotherhood as they really should. I think brotherhood has to be practiced in all situations. Let's go by the basic definition of brother. Does a brother remain a brother in one situation and not a brother in another situation? Then how can we have brotherhood in one situation and no brotherhood in the other situation? So it's very, very important that practice of brotherhood in all situations is always practiced. The same thing with vegetarianism. I have a friend of mine who says that he is a vegetarian, but he says that, well, when I go abroad, it becomes a little difficult, and hence I take hamburgers. I mean, this is not really then what he is practicing. So, brotherhood, as far as I'm concerned, in all situations, has got to be practiced.
Thank you.
Can I say?
Vic?
Yeah. My understanding of brotherhood is compassion, being loving, being understanding. And I think one can do this under any circumstance. A judge can make a judgment and send somebody to jail, and yet do that with compassion, a loving nature, and understanding. A father or mother can instill discipline in a child while still being loving, understanding, or compassionate. The same with a teacher, a leader. A manager can fire somebody because of transgression, but still be loving, compassionate, and understanding. I think there are no exceptions to this. It is possible to be brotherly or sisterly in whatever circumstance we find ourselves.
Thank you. Tim, do you want to add anything there?
There's really not too much to add to all of that.
All right, our next question. Does TS make this, and I'm assuming they're speaking brother-sisterhood, more visible in the world, for example, in mass media?
If the question is, does the TS make brotherhood more visible, or the unity of the human family, or unity in general more visible, it's always the hope. Certainly it's something that is part of our message. A good deal of that message coming across to the world, mass media perhaps plays a role in it, but I think always, Albert Schweitzer was asked a question. The question was, do you believe that example is the best form of leadership? His answer was no. Example is not the best form of leadership. It is the only form of leadership. And I think to a certain extent, what we have always been asked to embody within the TS, which is actually the most difficult calling for all of us, is this moment-to-moment, day-to-day expression in the face of shortcomings, which a few of us have. So in the face of the shortcomings which those few do have, that we still behave in a way that is not just respectful, but loving, compassionate, honest. So where those qualities exhibit themselves, then when you have something that is mass media oriented, there's some basis that communicates itself to others. Who you are speaks so loudly, nobody can really hear what's coming out of your mouth. So the ideal is to embody it. We're all at different stages along the way with that. But mass media in today's world, social media generally, is one of the major tools that we utilize to get the message out there and to connect people with the workers in the TS. So that's something that will only continue as more and more people become familiar with the usage of the social media particularly. Then that's something that will always be a service to the TS. The other day we saw John and Richard with the work they've done on Theosophy World. Exemplary, and the sort of model for the way that we are looking to express in the world.
Thank you. Pradeep will have something to add here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I really like this question because Theosophical Society must make it visible to the world wherever we practice brotherhood. See, you know, in Theosophy, we don't advertise. That is a no-no. But public relations is not advertising. In fact, the definition of public relation is, it is good work done by you, which is properly publicized and adequately acknowledged by people. This will allow people to know that such a thing as Theosophy exists. So I think letting people know through media, not by advertising, but by media itself, you know, making a note of this. It is very important that whenever we practice brotherhood, these things are made known. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, our next question is to our president, Mr. Tim Boyd. Words are being spread about a land deal being negotiated at Adyar. While we recognise that you cannot give information on an ongoing negotiation, can you at least tell us what you and the General Council are planning to do about it? Thank you.
Yeah, this is something that came up in our most recent General Council meeting. Really, is really an exciting moment for the Theosophical Society, particularly in Adyar. Maybe, I don't know what the general awareness is of history of some of the things at Adyar, but for the last 40 years, back to John Coates's time, when John Coates was international president, we have had the school from the Krishnamurti Foundation that has been operating on our campus, a portion of the campus that's called Damodar Gardens. The TS headquarters in Adyar is 260 acres, beautiful campus. And so they were operating on 14 of those acres in a corner of the property. Well, in the last less than a year, their occupancy of that property has ended. And so what we have been in the process of doing is speaking to develop that as sort of an educational corridor, not theosophical education specifically. It's a large tract of land, and what we find ourselves faced with, it may be something that you are unfamiliar with in your groups, but we have a certain limited amount of resources at the Adyar headquarters. And the sorts of developments that are required on this particular piece of land are extensive. And so what we have been in the process of doing is trying to work with a partner to develop the land for educational purposes. Fact of the matter is that any land there at the Theosophical Society, we have limitations on how we can utilize it. It must be used for educational, humanitarian, or philosophic purposes only. And so this is something that we've been in the process of doing. It's a very promising thing. It's something that we have spoken about and gone over in great detail with the General Council. And so we're moving forward with that. As things move along, we'll be able to tell you more about it. But it's an exciting moment for the TS, I do believe. I don't know if anyone wants to add. All of these people are members of the General Council as well, so if there's...
Pradeep.
Well, I think this is a very good question, and I really appreciate the person that has asked that, because they acknowledge that you cannot ask the details of a deal that is under negotiation. If that is democracy, well, I think in India people should have asked Prime Minister Vajpayee when the nuclear explosion was conducted, and nuclear tests were conducted, what is going on. Naturally, he's not going to be in a position to tell that. So similarly, the president here cannot give the details of an ongoing deal. So that was very well understood, I thought. The other thing, that the president was a real gentleman when he gave this answer. There are things that he cannot say, but the kind of harassment that has been going on the internet by people that have absolutely no idea, no qualification to talk about. They say, for example, that a land deal like this, you can get 4 times the amount that you have talked about. Now, they don't know that there are limitations on how you're going to use this land. If you're going to use the land for a nightclub or for a non-veg restaurant, yes, you can. But that's not what we can do. So there are limitations, and hence we have to go to an organization that will best serve the interest of Theosophical Society also. And hence, you may not get the kind of amount that you are trying, or that others expect that we should get. Second thing that is very, very important here is that it is the prerogative of the president and the general council to take a decision on this matter. This matter cannot be let loose to individual members of the Theosophical Society all over the world. They should have confidence that the people that they have selected, that they have elected, will do the best in terms of their abilities to get the best possible deal. Another very interesting Another very important thing that I think I would like to mention here is that they are very, very aggressive about the fact that the president has no right to take a decision because an administrative order had been passed that after 3 years a new election had to be taken. Now, this is again so far-fetched. There's so much of lies involved in all this kind of information. There is an order of the legislature that a new election has to be taken every 3 years, except in certain cases. And we have already applied for the exception, being an international body where it is very hard to conduct an election every 3 years, and hence to allow election to be conducted every 7 years as per our constitution, which has been there for so many decades. And very soon you will all hear that this is going to be approved. So if this is approved, well, that's going to be a big slap on the face of these people who are already declaring that Tim Boyd must resign. So this is nothing but malicious kind of propaganda that is going on. For what reason, I don't know. I cannot believe that a theosophist can do that. But another thing they say is that you can't give away the land for 40 or 60 years. Well, try to put yourself in the shoes of the school that is going to be built. They're going to spend tens of millions of dollars in making an international standard school. And if you say that, okay, after 10 or 15 years, you have to get out, they simply cannot recover their investment. So it has to be a long-term deal. We had a long-term deal with the Krishnamurti school, and we were able to get the land back. So there is no reason to say that, no, this land is already lost if you do this and all that. So I think it's very important for each and every one of us to spread this, that what is going on is a propaganda by a few people. In fact, there is one gentleman I must name so that you are careful when you receive an email from him. There is one Mr. Ramdas from Texas in US who is spreading this. And it is bad, it is wrong, and it is not in the interest of the Theosophical Society.
Maybe I'll just add something. Maybe many people here are not aware about this, the background of this. It is just simply somebody offered to lease the land of the former Krishnamurti school to put up educational institutions. And this has been submitted for approval, and it's still under negotiation. So that's the general situation. And as Pradeep has mentioned, sometimes there's a lot of misinformation going around, and it may be helpful to clear up these kinds of confusion in the minds of many members.
Thanks, Vic, and thank you, Pradeep, for such a comprehensive response there. It was appreciated. Now, our next question, we'll only have 2 more questions, that's all we'll have time for. Can the Theosophical Society, especially the TOS, register, collaborate, make known to the UN and their relief efforts, rescue efforts? It will make TS more popular too. So I'll hand that to you, Tim.
I think in the other day's presentation by Nancy Sechrist, our international secretary for TOS, she spoke about how the TOS and the TS have had a long-standing relationship with the UN, although it has not been one of a formal nature, largely because of the inability of the TS to commit itself to the political practices or points of views of any other organization. But this is something that has been ongoing. Annie Besant, prior to the formation of the UN, was a member of the League of Nations, the UN's predecessor. And so that's just something that I think will continue, where the TOS specifically is looking at ways to make a more formal relationship, but as yet we're not at that point.
Thank you. And our last question, I will ask Pradeep this question. What happens to the old gods and goddesses who were once worshipped and revered by humanity and now not so much? I mean, Odin, Thor, Freya from the Norse pantheon, Apollo, Athena, Pan from the Greeks. I'll leave that to you.
With your permission, if I can just add a little bit to the previous question.
Oh, that's fine.
You know, it would be very good for TS and TOS to collaborate with UN. I'm a Rotarian, and I would like to inform you all that Rotary had this idea of removing polio from the face of the earth. They did not go into it alone. They joined hands with UN. Joining hands with UN allowed them to get support from the government in all the countries. They had more than 1.3 million Rotarians and their wives who were going around spreading the awareness about the polio vaccines and all that. UN could have never done that alone themselves either. So a collaborated effort between Rotary and UN eliminated polio from all the countries except 2 where efforts are still going on. It's Pakistan and Afghanistan where polio still exists. But in India, polio is eliminated since 1911, and nobody had ever even dreamt that this could happen. So I think collaboration with UN, with UNICEF, with WHO would be a great idea.
Actually, Pradeep, before you go on, I'll just say the TOS does collaborate on the ground in many countries already. So I'll hand you on to the next one there.
Yeah, okay, very quickly. The only thing that can happen when you are thinking about the gods and goddesses that were once worshipped, when you start learning about Theosophy, is suddenly you'll find that there is no difference. I know of a Theosophist who was an ardent devotee of Lord Shiva, and he loved Theosophy too, but initially he had great trouble in understanding Lord Shiva versus the masters of TS and what to do about. But after a few years, he once said that I find that there is no difference between them right now. So I think the gods and goddesses can all remain. I don't think Theosophy prevents them from being worshipped. But yes, slowly, as you learn more about Theosophy, you will find that the difference will go away. It will fade away.
Thank you.
Can I say something about this?
Vic?
Yeah. I think this question is multifaceted. Where are Thor, Zeus, Jupiter today? First, Theosophy tells us that many of these are symbolic of certain natural forces and need not be taken literally. The second facet is that we have to realize that belief in gods, goddesses can change in cultures depending upon certain new influences. There are mainly two kinds of influences. The first kind is when a new religion, a new belief system comes to a culture and takes over and become dominant, either by conquest, by force, or by influence. For example, when Christianity rose up to become an official religion, it suppressed all the other religions in the Roman Empire. So that's by force. People who believed otherwise were called heretics, and they imposed the Inquisition in order to put out these kinds of heresy. But that's an artificial dominance because it is by military or political force. The second kind of influence is a natural one, which is not using force. For example, when Buddhism came to China, Japan, Tibet, it wasn't by force alone. They just became more dominant than the original ones like Shinto or Bon religion in Tibet. And so it's still like that right now, based on the choice and preferences of the people in those areas. The second factor in the change of a religion or beliefs in gods and goddesses is when there is the spirits of enlightenment, scientific as well as rationalistic enlightenment in civilization. So, for example, the anthropomorphic views of God would tend to begin to fade away in time whenever reason begins to see that the former beliefs in certain types of human-like gods or goddesses are not really congruent to reason. I grew up as a Catholic, and I grew up with a belief that God can be jealous, God can be angry, God can even repent. Now, I think reason tells us that if there's really such a God cannot repent. And so rational advancement in civilization will begin to replace many of these anthropomorphic views of God. And science also will begin to tell us more about the reality of nature as opposed to what was been traditionally given to us by religions. So these things allow people to change their views about these old gods, and some of the gods at present, not just the old gods, will one day fade away in the same manner. When reason, logic, and mysticism begin to become more dominant in civilization, then even some of the present gods today will disappear.
Thank you. Just before we finish, can I just ask Mr. Boyd to answer a question, not so much a question, just make a comment on the international speakers concept that's happening from Adyar. There was a question about speakers visiting lodges, so could you just comment from the international?
One of the things that it was mentioned, I think, in our first day about the different projects that we are undertaking is international speakers. It begins with an international speakers list where we will have speakers recommended from countries around the world capable to really communicate across regions, across nations. And so from that, then we're going to be developing the actual means to be able to send some of these speakers to different places around the world. So that's something that's in progress now.
So upcoming. So thank you. So it would be lovely to show our appreciation to our very learned panel here, but rather than by clapping, if we can do the traditional show of appreciation. Thank you. Thank you very much for being part of the panel.